Hi, everybody, and welcome to our live show for this group of people that still doesn't have a name. Just my friends that I gathered to talk about discourse and drama in the book community. And today we're going to talk about the first 3 months in 2021. So, things that we've seen, not everything. It was quickly apparent to me as I was preparing for this that it was just like way too much to cover, but we've got some highlights. So, I'll start with letting my panelists introduce themselves.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Sajid. I'm from the channel Books on My Social Life. And did I miss something? Oh, no.
No.
I'm from the channel Books on My Social Life. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at musaho_books.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paige, and you can find me literally everywhere on the internet under Minimal Bookie.
Hi, I am Deboki, and I am on YouTube at Okidoki Boki, and on Twitter at Okidoki_Boki, and then anywhere else with a thing, it would be Okidoki Boki. Just the Twitter that I had to underscore it.
And I didn't say, but hi, I'm Marines. This is my channel. So this is where you can find me on YouTube, and all of the other stuff that I do will be linked in the description, as well as with all of their channels. And also, I don't know if she's here because it's her birthday, but happy birthday to my best friend Nicole! Queen, we love you. So yes, we are going to the way that we're going to approach this is I'm going to give a brief recap of a thing that has happened in the first 3 months of 2021, and then we'll talk about it sort of amongst ourselves, react to the discourse, and then, try and bring some nuance, try and solve it like we solved consumerism.
Fixed it.
And I had this kind of in like, yeah, we did.
That's true.
The power. I had this kind of arranged by when it happened, but Paige added just yesterday, like a hot off the presses thing. So I want to start there. And it is basically that Jay Kristoff, the author, has a 4-arc special printing. And so he's been announcing it and promoting it, that his art, it's the same art, but it just has different covers. And so people are talking about the lack of support for BIPOC authors, and just especially in regards to ARCs and, lack of availability of ARCs when you have an author like Jay Kristoff getting 4 print runs of an ARC. And especially now, the timing of it is just quite interesting, considering that Jay Kristoff has been accused multiple times of sort of appropriating what do you say? How do you say this? Asian culture. So, and then, we're in the middle of Stop Asian Hate, and a lot of conversations about the way that, media and culture has added to sort of the anti-Asian sentiment that we're seeing, especially in the United States. So, how do you guys feel about, did you see the conversation? Because this is really popping off on Twitter yesterday, primarily, I think. So did you see this? Do you have any sort of reactions?
Anybody? I can go.
Yes.
I obviously saw it because I'm the one that put it in the doc. I didn't know who it was about first, because I just saw there was a conversation about ARCs and lack of ARCs versus based on what books get ARCs versus don't. And I thought that was really interesting, because that is something that I see on my side as a social media coordinator. The ARCs that I receive, often I have to fight to get them for myself even. And I really get what the authors are saying, because it is true. ARCs right now, they're not I saw somebody say, aren't they for proofreading or whatever? They're for marketing at this point. They're for marketing and publicity. They're a way to get the word out. Publishers have been using NetGalley a lot more and saying they don't have the money for print ARCs that they used to, which made me raise my eyes. I've never heard of a 4-arc run for what is the point of this? It's to raise exclusivity for the ARC. And I agree with all the conversations that are happening about the fact ARCs aren't supposed to be for sale, but you're making this seem like an exclusive limited edition. It's obviously to build buzz, but at this point, this is an author who has a fan base behind them, and they don't need this. So it's frustrating to see this, especially being on the other side of the conversation and knowing they're saying we're not publishing as much physical ARCs because it's bad for the environment. Now why are you doing this? it's kind of hypocritical for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think like a thing that comes up, like I think in the context of like book events too, is like that idea of arcs as like status symbol, and like it also comes up in the context of like how like certain people get arcs, like it's almost like a way to like kind of feel like you've made it maybe. And I don't know enough about J. Kristoff to like be able to say about that, but I don't know, it's very weird, like an arc special printing.
Yeah, what immediately came to my mind when I saw like this coming up was that when we did the conversation, or I guess this was Paige and I, when we were talking about Sasha Alsberg and sort of her like selling arcs, you know, the basis of that is this idea that, or, you know, there's an agreement between reviewers and publishers, even though it's not illegal to sell arcs, but like the agreement is you're sending this promotional material, we're not going to sell it, right? But then you see something like this, and I'm like, I went to bat for you, publishing, and like said, don't do it. Like, this is bad. But it's almost like the way that they're treating arcs, especially in something like this with a special printing, you're encouraging it. You're obviously encouraging a level of like collecting, and people who are fans are going to want to collect them all. So what kind of message is that sending? And then, so if you're sending that message, then later you can't come back and be like all upset that people are selling arcs or collecting arcs or things like that. You're the one encouraging it at this point. So.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I'm taking off my camera for now because of the Wi-Fi issues. But no, I agree completely, and I think that it's very excessive. Like 4 arcs, like when you stop and really think about it, like 4 covers for an arc. Like an arc is just supposed to be something to like create hype around a book. It's just supposed to be something for reviewers to kind of give feedback about the book before it's published. But the fact that they are like giving 4 arcs, is like you said, they're literally turning it into this kind of like promotional collectible product thing. And you know, years down the line, people are going to want to sell those things, like, you know, vintage arcs of J. Kristoff's book, you know, version 1, version 2. So I think it's very aggressive and very unnecessary as well.
Yeah.
And like it's a show of monetary support as well, because like arcs cost money to print, and like that's why they've been cutting back on everything, especially like during the pandemic. At the beginning they were scared, even though we sold more books than we've ever sold, apparently, according to all the articles I've seen. So like it's frustrating to see the amount of monetary support. Like, yes, he's a best-selling author, but after coming off with all of your like, we're gonna do better starting from last year, and like repeating yourselves again this year, it's like a show that you're actually not doing any better than you said you were going to. And like because he's a best-selling author, he doesn't really need it. And also, I don't think people realize how much bestsellers are kind of bought by publishing. Like, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, like in terms of marketing publicity campaigns, and like with the New York Times bestseller list, like there's like money and stuff involved. Like, people can make bestsellers if they so chose to put that support, and like that, this is an example of that.
Yeah, that is also like the big sticking point, is that like, okay, if arcs are meant for like marketing and publicity, what marketing and publicity one are you getting with a 4 arc print run? It's the same arc over and over again, but sure, fine, okay. But also, what marketing and publicity does J. Kristoff need at this point? You know, like you would imagine that those resources would go to, like we're talking about, like, you know, little known or debut authors, or, you know, BIPOC authors who need the help to get their names out there. And so when you're saying that, well, no, there's no resources available for you guys, but there is resources available for this guy who's going to sell the books anyway, like that messaging from publishing is not the best.
And like, that's the whole problem with marketing, publicity, and publishing in general, is like they don't put as much into like the BIPOC author, especially when they're debuting, and even less support if their first book did like okay, but not like a bestseller. Then they won't even like do the same level of support versus like a white author who gets like multiple chances on the mid list with the same amount of marketing. And like, this is just an example of that. It's so frustrating as a marketing person seeing it happen still.
Yeah, I'm like so curious about what the numbers are like, because I like Maria's saying, like I feel like the returns just like, it seems so like I can't imagine like that once you're getting to the point where you're doing like 4 special covers of an arc, that you're like getting that much more like on like in your return on that. Like I mean, maybe you do, it's just hard for me to imagine that. because the books are already going to be talked about. Like, it's Jake Kristoff. Like, I might not have read these books, but I've still heard of him. Like, it's just hard for me to imagine.
Oh, this is interesting in the comments. So I do ghost reviews for a living, and this whole thing is said to be, we're helping the fans by giving them something they can sell in the future as a bonus payment since we don't pay for their reviews.
Pay people then. My God. Pay reviewers if you want them to feature. Like, obviously not for reviews, but if you want them to feature stuff, then pay them for that.
Yeah, weird.
I'm so tired.
Yeah. It's the equivalent of like the slap in the face is the publishing tells BIPOC authors there's no resources, right? We don't have any. But the truth is we don't have resources for you. So like, if that's a thing, say that thing because seeing it later, it's like if your mom was like, you got McDonald's money, but then bought your older sister McDonald's, and you're like, what? I thought we didn't have McDonald's, so like we see that you have the resources, it's just not for me. And I think that is, especially for already a problematic author. I've read one Jay Kristoff book back in 2012, but he's like, his name comes up pretty regularly just because of the way that he interacts with his fans. So I'm already a little salty that I'm like, no good things for you.
Yeah, and like, okay, my brain just completely lost my train of thought, but it was based on something you had just said. So we're off to a great start.
Just so you guys know, before we went live, we were talking about how our brains are off because it's a Sunday night.
I think I was going to say, before I lose this train of thought again, they're going to say it's because he's a bestseller. They're going to say, like, because he's a bestseller, like they're putting this money in because all the money that they make from him is going to go toward like acquiring other authors. But then, like, really, where does that money go? I'm curious sometimes.
Right. It's like the Twilight argument, not to bring up Twilight every time we're together, but it's like the Stephanie Meyers of the world fund all of like, Sajid is like, yes, you do bring up Twilight every time. But it's like, we fund you, but to what end? If there are no resources, if there's no marketing, and those funds are being redirected right back into the same old, white bestsellers. So
it's almost like if you like found your industry on racist bones, you then get continued bad representation, or you get bad diversity. Like,
imagine.
That's like one thing we've been asking about behind the scenes, specifically like at my company, because we had a very problematic author recently published, and we're like, we need more transparency about where the actual money, like, you have to show us that the money is going toward where you say it's going to go. Like, that's something we're trying to fight for, but like, it's an industry that was rooted in racism, so we'll see.
So I'm wondering, does this kind of marketing even reach people who aren't entrenched in bookish spaces anyway?
No. It's literally just for the bookish people.
Yeah.
Literally, that's all it's for.
Yeah.
Most people don't care about like different editions of books and stuff like that.
Most people don't know what ARCs are.
Yeah.
Like, if you say the term ARC,
exactly,
nobody's going to know. I have to say, like, advanced reader edition. We give those to reviewers. Like, nobody knows outside of these spaces.
I like Bethany's conspiracy theory.
I love this too. I wonder if they're pushing his book more because he's been involved in some bad behavior and controversies in the past year, which could be very, like, I could totally see that happening, but I want to go to like the marketing person or the publicist who thought that this would be the good way to get, like, to have his name involved in like discourse in a positive way, and didn't think that all the way through because I will say before we move on here, unless anybody has anything else. Now, honestly, the way that this has like hit me is I'm kind of like, you know what? F it, sell your ARCs. If you got them, sell them.
No outrage.
Truly, I'll say nothing because of my job, but
okay,
do what you will. No, I'm just like, do what you will.
Okay, so going back to the beginning of the year, we started a doc right after our last like year in review thing last year, and on the first day that we started this doc, Paige put this in. So at the very beginning of the year, a book talk went viral. It was basically the book talk thing, or the TikTok thing was basically like, what's something that isn't illegal that feels illegal? And somebody like stitched this and said, and it was basically showing people how to pirate books, which is illegal. So that's, really funny. But it started the discourse on Twitter about piracy being illegal versus the privilege of having resources, which are not always options in other countries or available to people kind of widespread. So how do we feel about authors coming out to speak about piracy?
I don't have a problem with authors speaking about piracy because I understand that it affects your books and your sales and whatnot. And I do think that it's especially bad when it's a smaller author or maybe an independent author or somebody whose book is just not selling as much, right? So like, I don't have an issue when authors come out and like criticize it. I just have an issue with the whole system itself. Like, I mean, because coming from the perspective of somebody who doesn't live like in the global north, like I know how hard it is for people to access a lot of these books, right? So these books are published, they're really, really popular. These publishing companies market them and, make so many people across the world want to read them, right? They're publishing 4 arcs of one book and doing all sorts of different things to promote these books and these stories. And so when people want to read them, they want to read them, but they have no access to them. Like our libraries here generally don't get a lot of these new releases and these new books, right? The bookstores don't get a lot of them. And when they do, they sell them for very expensive. And then the other option is to order them, which shipping from like those countries in the global north will be additional expenses that like you all wouldn't have to pay if you live there. So it's very expensive and it's really, really difficult to get a hold of all of these books, right? So when you're going online and you're looking at book reviews and everybody is saying, read, Six of Crows and A Court of Thorns and this and that, right? Everybody's talking about how these books are amazing, right? And they're everywhere, they're ubiquitous. So people will want to read them, but they have no other ways of accessing them. So honestly, PDFs and illegally downloading the books become like the only valid option. And I'm not trying to say that as to like defend, the idea of pirating books, because I know that it's illegal and I know that it's unethical. But like, I think the problem really is the fact that we live in a capitalist system where people just don't really have the same levels of access to certain resources. And for some people, something like a book, a PDF of a book, like most people I know who do this don't even see it as like stealing. They don't think of it as like stealing. It doesn't even occur to them that that's a form of theft, right? It's just like, oh, I'm just downloading a book to read it on my laptop, on my phone, So I'm not trying to be an apologist for something illegal, but at the same time I am. So yeah.
I get where you're coming from too, because like I obviously grew up in Barbados, so like we don't get access to a lot of things like you're saying. Like a Twilight book cost me $40 Barbadian dollars, and the living like the salary hourly was $6. So how much would I have had to work? Like I obviously bought them because my parents were lovely and they like afforded me certain privileges, but it's also like part of the culture. And like we don't get a lot of access to stuff. So I'm just thinking of like DVDs that used to get burnt of like popular movies that you could buy for $10. Like that's just like part of like living in the global south because of the disparity in like what you can afford. And like my brain is like, if you can afford to buy a book, buy it. Don't pirate it if you can afford it. But like if you're living in the globe, I'm not gonna come here and be like, get it from your library, because I know you cannot do that. So like I feel like it's such a nuanced conversation that people are just like looking down on people who can't afford something, saying, well, because you can't afford it, that means you shouldn't have it. And like capitalism, baby, like it always comes back.
When the whole publishing industry is telling you in the first place that you need to read this and you need to have it, right? And I often tell people, like, just look at the authors as well. Like, if it's an author, as I said, who doesn't have a lot of a platform, don't pirate their books. Buy it, right? Support them. But if it's like Stephen King, send the Z Library link, right? You know what I'm saying? Like,
and I also wonder if, oh no, go ahead.
I think that the thing here, so people are mentioning too, how that the pirating conversation is interesting because we do get into this portion of talking about access, right, in the global south and things of that nature, but that there have been, somebody mentions like a study done where the study found that most people who pirate could afford the item, and how a lot of people who are like, but think of the access, are people themselves who probably could access the book but are pirating anyway. So there is a lot of like gray area in the conversation, and I think the issue is, though, when people come out to speak about pirating, they make these like general blanket statements that like that's where I start to get angry, because then you have authors being like, don't steal from me, use the library. And I'm like, oh honey, it like not everybody has access to the library. So now you've like redirected the conversation from piracy to access, because you've made this like broad statement that doesn't even go here. So yeah. But then I start to think about too, like people who, you know, a lot of us who are really entrenched in the bookish community, that we buy a lot of books, right? We are funding a big portion of, you know, the publishing industry. So at what point, you know, are you like yelling at me about pirating a book? If I bought 100 books this year, but I pirated 20, like, do I deserve your lecture? I don't know.
And I feel like part of it is too, like, we have to look at the royalty system itself, because authors get paid pennies for their ideas are worth, and like compared to the amount that the publishing company makes. So it actually is something we should probably be looking into, because I feel like that's part of the author's frustration, is like they barely get any money from it until they like are like they pay out their advance, and like how many authors are actually able to do that. So like that is another part. I feel like that's part of the systemic problem of why it keeps coming up, because that's never changed.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's hard, like, to think about it. Like, it's always from the author side. Like, I'm not really too concerned about publishing. I mean, I'm concerned existentially in that I want there to be a publishing industry, but like, really, it's like the authors who, like, I wish they were maybe like more nuanced in how they talked about it. But I also get like kind of why it's hard for them to be nuanced, because I think for me, if it were like a thing that was personal to me, I would lose all sense of perspective. And I think, you know, sometimes when you lose all sense of perspective, it's better to like think about what and how you're going to share your opinions. But like, it would be like pretty difficult for me to not be like, you know, this is so personal to me and so personal to like my way of life, especially like you're saying, like smaller authors who are like putting their work into this stuff. And especially like we're talking about like them not being supported by publishing. It's just like, I don't know what their publishing deals look like. I don't know if it affects the way their books get distributed, if that's like a factor as well. And like, yeah, it's tough.
Yes. And I am a big proponent, like backing away from this a little bit. Like I think that artists should be paid. Right. And so that conversation of artists needing to be paid, right, it often gets like kind of shunted into these areas where we're talking about like piracy and the like, but we should also be talking about like, you know, the structure of like royalties in the publishing industry and things like that I think also are a big part of this conversation. So I personally, you know, am in a position where I can buy books and support the authors that I want to support. I have a really great library system, and I don't actually have the need to pirate books because I have access to books in this way. But I get the passion on both sides, right? I get the passion of like, you're actually stealing from me and I need to pay my bills and have a way to feed myself. And then also, but like books are, you know, a luxury item sometimes, and people don't have access to them. And they, you know, the whole capitalism thing of like, no access means you can't get it. Like that sucks too, so.
And like for some people who were in the chat were saying like how the study about like mostly people who can afford.
One of those things where I think it's like two things could be.
Go Sachet.
Oh, sorry, my Wi-Fi is being homophobic as usual. I don't know if y'all could, y'all hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, y'all can hear me, yes. I assume. I was going to say that is one of those conversations where like two things could be right at the same time. Right. And again, I don't blame individual authors for being upset about it, because you have every right to be, especially if you're not getting the money that you know that you deserve for your work, right? And especially if the piracy is affecting that. I think my issue is more so with the wider system itself, and not really so much with the authors being upset.
Yeah. It may be illegal, but I don't consider it unethical. And the second part of that was capitalism has no business dictating ethics, which is interesting. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at too, of like, you know, is it unethical if you don't have access, you know, to obtain or whatnot? So.
Yeah, that's true.
And about the people who are saying like the whole like if they can afford they'll buy. I mean, they won't buy. Like sometimes most of the people are people who are like pirating or people who could afford it. I wonder if part of that is due to like I feel like that's people who don't value intellectual property or art, like some, like if they can afford it and they're like, well, it's not actually worth the money that I could spend on it. And also like if they can't get it right now from the library and they still do it, it might be just like, because of the society we live in, we feel like we should have a right, like we should have everything we want immediately. And like there's a sense of immediacy to everything versus waiting like the 16 weeks or whatever it might take for you to get a book. So I feel like those two factors also play into the people who can afford it but still choose to pirate.
Pirating school books, school textbooks.
Listen, I'm not saying anything.
I don't feel bad. Like, before I was like, I don't know. I think ethics plays a role with textbooks.
The whole educational publishing industry is a mess by itself. It is terrifying.
Send the link, send the Zebra, send the books.org link, send all the links.
All right. Unless there's anything else, I know I skipped a little bit of the chat, but I get behind and then it rushes me forward and it's a mess. But we've got a lot to talk about. So here we're moving on to the next thing. And it is another thing that, your girl is fond of bringing up, and that is Sarah Janet Maas.
Is Janet really her middle name?
It's really her middle name, I think.
I thought you were joking. Oh my god, I don't know. Why would I know this?
I found out through I don't know. Don't quote me on this. I saw somebody else refer to her as Sarah Janet Maas, and I'm like, oh, that's perfect. I hope that's true. Someone look it up and tell me
something like Janet or Jeanette or Jessica.
Apologies to everyone named Janet watching this right now.
I know. The only way it would have been more perfect.
Not all Janet.
Not all Janet.
You are correct. It is Janet.
Amazing. Okay, so this happened at the end of last year, end of 2020. But Maas revealed her cover for A Court of Silver Flames with the caption that was basically like, "So happy to reveal my cover. I hope it's a bit of light for you guys today, given the appalling lack of justice for Breonna Taylor." And then she goes on to sort of take it in a political direction, encouraging people to vote. This was before the November election. And, giving it a social justice sort of angle, but it was a cover reveal. So this got brought up again, even though it happened last year, because her book was published recently. And primarily on TikTok, people were talking about the new book. And a lot of others who are anti Sarah Janet Maas were commenting on TikToks and being like, she's problematic, and citing this particular caption as like a big reason why she is problematic. I saw TikToks from Maas fans claiming that they even received like death threats from people who were saying not to read Sarah Maas because she's problematic. So it became a whole kerfuffle over on TikTok. And then more recently, it was announced that Hulu was developing a TV adaptation of A Court of Thorns and Roses. And there's an actress, Danielle Rose Russell, who's somebody who has been fan cast in adaptations. And she followed Maas right after the announcement, and then she liked like the announcement tweet itself or whatnot. So people immediately were like, "Is this Farah?" And then they started body shaming her on Twitter to the point where she quit Twitter and unfollowed everyone on Instagram because people were being so awful to her, saying that she was too fat to play Farah and not pretty enough to play Farah. So that's a lot. But how do we feel about the Breonna Taylor caption? Because I feel like I saw people defending the caption and saying that it was like fine for her to sort of like, she had to announce her new cover, but at least she highlighted or put some attention. She has a big platform on like these issues of Breonna Taylor and the election and encouraging people to vote. So do you feel the same way? Was that in good taste?
I mean, was it a good taste? Probably not. But I'm curious. Like there is a part of me, a very bad part of me, that is curious if like this is effective. Like, is this actually a way that people who weren't aware of Breonna Taylor and like all of the things that people have been talking about, is this an effective way to get people to engage with that? I don't think so. Like, that's my guess. Like, but I don't know. celebrities and like pop, like, I don't know, creators like at this level, like using their platform to like promote one thing and then latch on this other message. Just like always, like, it's never a good combination.
It's very, justice for Brianna, but also buy my book kind of vibes. And that's, even though that might not have been her intention, and I'm sure her intention was to try to bring light to it, I just thought, marketing a book about your, white people fantasy, and then sort of bringing in this very serious political issue, it doesn't mesh well for me. It's like putting ketchup on ice cream. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I feel like what would have been more appropriate is if she really felt the need to say something about Breonna Taylor, she could have had 2 different posts. So post up your, cover reveal or something, or maybe you could do a post talking about your thoughts on the politics and telling people to vote and whatnot. And then later on, the next day or 2 days later, post your cover reveal and something like that. I just feel like the 2 of them don't really go together that well. And when I read the caption, it just made me cringe. And I don't know if that's just me being judgy, but I just feel like that's not really 2 appropriate things to have in one post. I don't know.
It's a classic case of white woman thinking they're doing something.
Yes. Yes.
I think I agree that I think that it was like the meshing of like the promotional thing, especially, like considering, again, just like with Jay Kristoff, considering what he has been like a kind of criticized for, the timing of it is like, oh man, this is like not the right moment for you. And considering that what I think makes Sarah J. Maas like actually problematic is not even like the lack of diversity in her fantasy, but that, I mean, the one that I did read, A Court of Thorns, no, the other one, Throne of Glass, had like a mystical minority in it. And like the fact that like you don't have any, or you didn't at that point have any other minorities, but the one that you did is like a super stereotype and a trope, like that was more problematic to me. So we all know that her books are like jars of mayonnaise, right? They're Wonder Bread in action. So for her to be like, here's my newest white book, but justice for Brianna, like, oh, bad taste. I don't think that was like the right call.
I can't remember the copy exactly, but like, did she call out to anywhere that people could like go to do some kind of action, like go up to my stories to like donate to this specific? Because I feel like if the whole point was for her to use the cover reveal as a positive way, because she knew she was going to get a lot of eyes on it, it just feels performative in a way. Like she's like, I know I have to say something about this because I have to do this cover reveal today, but also she's not actually like doing something active. And I feel like that's where a lot of authors and publishers are right now, where they're like, we're learning the words, here are the words, let me show you the words, but they're not actually doing something active to actually combat anything.
Yeah. So we've got some mixed reaction. I wasn't bothered by the post. And, Bethany points out that she does have a ton of influence on her younger fans. Good taste does not equal problematic. So it might not have been in good taste, but that wasn't necessarily a problematic thing to do. Same thing. I don't know that I would call it problematic. Is this a pattern of behavior for SJM? I'm not really familiar with her outside of the fact that she is a popular author. I don't know if it's a pattern of behavior. Like I said, her books are not like, you're not going to go there and get a ton of representation or diversity. But also she's not super engaged like online and on social media. She's kind of kept herself always a little bit apart. So I wouldn't say that this is a pattern of behavior as far as I know, but I'm not a Sarah J. Maas fan. So what do I know?
Yeah.
And like somebody was asking if authors can just not promote their books and stuff. With an author that big, it's sort of you kind of like have to share it because like the publishing company is going to expect that you do, but there is flexibility around when. Like there have been things that we've pushed off because stuff was happening on social. We're like, we're not posting today because it's a bad time to like take up space. So I wonder if there were conversations where they were like, no, you have to. I'm very curious about like the flexibility that she was allowed with that post, and if that was her way of fighting. I don't know. I don't have like a lot of opinions about Sarah J. Maas.
Well, I'm going to ask you more questions about her.
Oh, God.
But I think I saw somebody mention in the comments, I can't find it now, but I had it written here. Do you think that there is unnecessary hate for Sarah J. Maas?
I don't know. I don't really see a lot of people like hating on her often. And usually if I see like an intense sort of criticism, it's usually of the work and not so much the author. But I don't really follow up too much on discourse when it comes to like those types of books, like young adult fantasy and stuff. So I'm usually out of the loop with that.
Yeah, I feel like Sarah J. Maas to me is like very like when I think of like what the big world of BookTube looks like to people, like when you first walk into BookTube, like she is the author I think of, and then like once you get into BookTube and you find your little corner, like for me she was like an author I was aware of for like 5 minutes, and then like kind of was like I don't think her books are for me, and just like walked away, and like we'll see her name come up, but
yeah, I feel like it's common and like popular to like make Sarah J. Maas jokes because like I'm the same way where like I read one of her books, the first Court and Thorns and Roses book, and like I tried to read the second one and it wasn't for me. So I was like, okay, she's not for me, but like I'll still find myself like liking like funny tweets about it. So like it's part of like book Twitter culture at this point. I don't know if I don't know anything about the hate though, because I'm not one of her readers or interested in like that part. I just ignore it completely.
I think I could safely say maybe she doesn't deserve a lot of hate. Maybe her work deserves criticism. And maybe her actions, like for example, that post, we could have conversations about it. We could be critical of the way that she does or says certain things. But I don't necessarily know that I've heard anything of her where I think she's deserving of any kind of like immense amount of like hatred or backlash or anything like that. But that's because I just don't know what she's done or said.
Yeah. I think that sort of, not that it's right by any regard, but I think the amount of like hate that she gets is kind of on par for like the amount of popularity that she has. I think that once you get like you hit a critical mass of like, you know, pop culture, it just is kind of par for the course for the sort of criticism that you get. Again, not saying that it's necessarily like needed, but I don't think that she receives like any like wild and like out of, you know, she's a tiny author and she's getting all of this hate for no reason. She's a wildly popular author that has included some really, you know, problematic things in her work and has been called out for like real things. But then also like I think that apart from that, people kind of conflate hate for her work with hate for the author. You know, like I don't often see people being like, Sarah Maas, that cow. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but usually it's like ACOTAR sucks. That's me, you know, and that has nothing to do with Sarah Maas as a person. I think her books are legitimately terrible. So I say that and I share that opinion. The thing is that like, you know, you have the complete opposite, and the vast majority is people who think that her books are like the holy grail. So I think that a lot of times what we are conflating is like hate for the work with hate for the author, which, you know, it is what it is.
Someone brought up a really good point.
And I was just going to say a lot of popular authors just do write mediocre books, right? And even though they might be enjoyable, there's a kind of mediocrity that's worth talking about and kind of, you know, eventually like criticizing and making jokes about if it's a big popular author. Sorry, Paige.
Oh, no worries. I was just gonna say somebody made a point like questioning if part of the reason like there's so much like hate / like hype around this series and like this conversation always coming up is because it's like a primarily teen young female audience, and like the disdain we generally have because like coming as somebody who was in the One Direction fandom at its peak when I was myself a teenager, it was definitely there's a lot of people who like hate on you just because you like this thing that they consider like trivial, and I don't think like that's the majority of everything, but I do think like some of the hate does come from the fact that like teen girls really are a huge fan of like they're the fan base and they're very like passionate. Obviously, when you're at that age and you're like you're feeling all the feelings and all the hormones, like of course they're going to be like defending to the death, and like that's part of like the fandom toxicity is coming from.
Yeah. It always just bothers me because this feels like somebody said this feels like Twilight 2.0, and it bothers me that because we tend to have these conversations about like the unnecessary hate geared towards things that are female driven and like young females especially, but that the examples are things that are like as much as this is not objective because it's all subjective, but like objectively bad, like, and so it's like from the other side, it feels like you can't criticize it and you can't say this thing is like, I don't think that this is good quality, because people then like immediately go to, well, she's a woman and her primary audience is girls, so you can't say that. And I'm like, well, I think her writing is bad, and in fact her like books include problematic like presentations of women in relationships with men, and most of her like male characters are alpha holes, and they're like you know very controlling. And so this whole idea of like, okay, we're defending her and her work, but what are the messages at her work, and what is her work actually presenting, that kind of gets lost in the sauce. And then you know it just immediately becomes this thing of like, well, you're just hating because of XYZ. When I'm, you know,
it's the Twilight conversation all over again, right? Like, you know, when I think Lindsay Ellis made a video kind of sort of saying that a lot of the hate towards Twilight was primarily because it's for young teenage girls. And it's like, no, Twilight has like a lot of things worth hating and worth criticizing. And like, we can acknowledge that, yes, the teenage girl hate and the misogyny is a part of it. But the ultimate, like, you know, you can't dismiss the problem with the actual work itself. And the fact that, as you rightfully said, Marinas, a lot of this work is bad for the teenage girls who are reading it in some cases, especially when it comes to the romance and those types of things.
Yeah, when I think of this conversation, I think of something very non-book related, but still very fandom related, which is Taylor Swift, because I am a big Taylor Swift fan, but also like she has a very toxic fandom that like I personally like don't really like to engage with. I only like if something seems to be happening, I will swoop into Reddit to like find out what I need to know that's going to happen, and then I like immediately leave. And it feels very similar because like unlike Twilight, I don't think of Taylor Swift's music for the most part as particularly problematic. Like there are some songs, especially in the old, like the old Taylor oeuvre, that like yes, like Better Than Revenge, like a little bit problematic. But like over time has evolved, but the way that like we talk about her is often rooted in misogyny. But also she has done things in the way that she like builds her image, in the way she is like kind of like staged herself as a celebrity and like promoted a certain relationship with her fans that like incites a lot of like very, very like harassing kind of behavior towards people who don't like her. Like just people who write like negative reviews of her music will like get harassed by her fans, and then stuff like that, where it just, part of me is like, especially like with this stuff with the actress and everything, like part of me is like, you guys, like none of these people are like paying us. Like no one is paying me enough to like harass someone on their behalf. Like a lot of the times when it becomes that toxic, I'm just like, it's really hard, I don't know, for me to understand where that like drive comes from.
I think part of it is like when you really, really like something, sometimes it becomes part, like you think it's part of your personality to really, really, this represents me as a human. I feel like that's Taylor Swift specifically. Like when you're talking about that, I was like, people are so into it that it's like becomes like they think you're attacking them because they like this thing, when really you're just attacking the piece of art. And I feel like that's where some of like the vitriol really does come from, when they think like because you don't like a specific thing, it means you think they're a lesser person for liking it, when really you're just like, nah, it's just not for me, and I have a right to be able to say that.
Yes. And this was kind of where I wanted to get into next, is kind of like the fandom piece of it, because honestly, when I read the first Throne of Glass book, and I read the first and second of the ACOTAR books, and you know, I thought Throne of Glass was better. By the time that I got to the second ACOTAR, like it was livid at the mediocrity, and honestly, the way that we have rewarded the mediocrity, especially this is like a test of mine, especially when I see people like sort of criticizing work by BIPOC authors for being derivative in any way, and then they are also like Sarah J. Maas stans. I'm like, something's not adding up here, to me personally. But you know, where I wanted to get is that even though like her books were like whatever to me, the fandom has really soured me on her books as well. And so my question is, like, we know not all fans, but the toxicity of her fandom is like a thing and we've seen it like come up multiple times. They ran this poor girl off of Twitter, right? That wasn't even like confirmed to be part of the cast. And the tweets that I was seeing was all about like, we don't even want this like adaptation. Nobody will be pretty enough to play Feyre. They're not going to do the book justice, and things that were like very weird. So how much responsibility do you think an author has for their fandom? Or like, what is a fandom reflective of anything in terms of the work or the author?
I don't know if it's like reflective of the author. I have like think on more like that part, but I do think there is some responsibility there, that if you know that your fandom is doing this kind of stuff, you can come in, especially if you have a large audience, to say like, I don't condone this, please stop doing this. Like, I appreciate your support, but like, this is a step too far for me personally. Like, don't do it. Like, I feel the same thing was happening. Well, it's not the same thing happening, but like, people are expecting like authors, they do ask authors to speak out on certain situations. Like, what do you think of this kind of thing? And I feel like it's one of those situations where even if you don't tell somebody to do it, even though you don't have like control over what each individual in your fandom does, you do have a way in shaping it and like setting an example. And like, I feel like a lot of authors are just like, I don't control them, they're humans of themselves, but you can say something.
Silence can be complicit too, right? Like, there's no harm in coming out, especially if it amounts to somebody being body shamed and, you know, deciding to deactivate that. Like, that's a big deal, right? Like, that is a lot, and that's somebody actually being traumatized. So I think that is an appropriate situation. I don't know if Ma said anything, but I do think that that's an appropriate situation to come in and be like, yeah, I don't condone this. This is wrong. Your actions have caused somebody to be traumatized by the way that you spoke about them, and to the point where they had to leave this space, which is wrong, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think that and this is definitely a case where if, you know, you need to be made aware that it happened and you need to speak out again about it. You know, not, and the thing that I think about like fandoms and communities in general is that I don't know that Sarah J. Maas is directly responsible for her fandom, but I think that they can be reflective of something. I don't know. I just think about the way that we talk about like the booktube community in general, for instance, and how we talk up against things that we see that are problematic because we're trying to shape this community, right? And we want to say, if I'm participating here, I want it to be reflective of like things that I believe. So, and if I don't agree with what's happening here, then I'm not going to want to participate here. So I think that some of that thinking, I think, you know, there's no way that she can control all of the fandom, but I think that there is a way that she can help to shape some of the conversations that are in the fandom, at least.
I think that's something that, like, I don't know, I don't mean to put this on publishing because maybe that's not their responsibility, but I think in general, social media for authors is probably pretty tough. And it's just like, I mean, social media in general is like much harder than I think people like fully give it credit for. Even all of us who like use it all the time and might be like, yeah, Twitter really sucks. Like, Twitter's really hard. I think when you're getting to a certain level of success and fame and like audience, it is that much harder, which is not to like take away the responsibility. It makes it that much more important to be responsible. But I don't know, how do you best be responsible in some of these cases? What is the line between like, I'm going to call this out versus I don't want to draw attention to something, to like, I want to give these people an audience. Like, I think there are cases where like it's very clear you should say something, but then I don't know. I don't have a good answer. It's just like the messiness of social media.
Grace says authors don't have control over who reads their work, but they do have control over who they make comfortable in the spaces they create. Which is, but it is true. Navigating that space of like when to call out versus when to ignore, like I don't know, like how do you go about making those decisions? But I think in this particular case, like having somebody run off Twitter, like that's a good time to speak up, I would say.
Yeah. Very much so.
Especially because like if you don't call it out now, like it could easily happen again. Like you're setting precedent to like say like, oh, she didn't say it was bad last time. So
totally.
Yeah, people are just saying the same thing in terms of author having responsibility. It's about using your influence over fandom to stop them from having mob-like behavior. You'll never be able to really influence sort of like the extremes of your fandom because those things will always sort of exist. But I think that at least if there's some like record of you being like, this is not what I promote, this is not what I want my community to be about, this is not what my books are about, then, you know, that counts for something.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like Harry Potter fandom of yore, like, and the toxic shit that like you can see the like I'm already blanking on what the fandom history pages are, the fandom wiki page or whatever. But like I'm just thinking of like when Cassandra Clare was a fanfic writer and the shit she got up to, and like imagining like now knowing like J.K. Rowling and being like, but like and having zero like trust in her, but also just like imagining her being like, Cassandra Clare, you should not do this, but.
All right. Anything else? You guys already gave me more feelings on Sarah J. Maas than you have. Like, I kept asking questions, and you're like, "We don't care."
Somebody's talking about ship wars. Well, just said the ship wars ... and that makes me think of what was happening with the Shadow and Bone series that's coming out, and some of the stuff we're seeing come out of that now, where people were using the article that was going around from the actress that was playing Alina, talking about the addition of racism toward Asian people in the show being added, and then people were using that to further their shipping. The Darkling and Alina are the obvious right pairing because of this addition, and shipping is a whole, like, that's become a whole thing that I feel has changed from when I was a kid.
Fictional.
When they said ship wars, I thought they were somewhat actual, like boat.
Oh my god, this is the Swiss now. That ship war.
The sergeant is like, ship wars?
We're like back in the Iliad.
Wait, what is like World War III is going on? This is ridiculous.
Yeah, like I feel like when I was younger, maybe I was very into my ships, but like as a personal thing, like I really think Harry and Hermione should be together, like that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't go to bat for that because I knew like I could just read fanfic about it.
Yeah.
I'm with you, Jocelyn. I have not been paying attention to, like, I haven't even watched the trailer. I'm going to watch the show, and I'm in the process of rereading the books because I never went past the first one. But I cannot pay attention for my own health. I cannot pay attention to the discourse around the Darkling. And
I feel like I'm gonna have to like mute it before the show comes out because I feel like it's gonna get to be too much. It was like okay with a lot of like excitement, and now I'm like I don't want to deal with like the shippers who are younger. Like I am an old 27-year. Like don't come at me with your ships. I don't care.
I need that list of like mute words like for the next
circulate
it.
A mass email. Like if you want the mute words, let's go. Let's for all of our health. Like we need to do this because I can't do it. Like I have feelings about it. I have opinions, but I don't want discourse about it. I don't want to hear. No, thank you.
I'm at a point with some of these things where like I've got my opinion. I genuinely don't care. There are questions where I want other people's opinions, and there are questions where I'm like, I'm done. I there's nothing that's going to change. I have no other thoughts I'm going to apply to this. So.
Yeah, I'm real scared for the discussions.
None of us are ready for the absolutely toxic discourse that will come out of Sean. Like nobody is ready.
Yeah. Man, it's such a relief that like Sailor Moon came out pre-Twitter. Like
stop.
That would have been devastating.
Oh my.
Okay, so moving on from here, we're going to an author named Isabella Sterling. So she is an author of dark romances who also chose to write under the pen name Chelsea Millen. So she wrote a contemporary romance about two Black characters, and she started to get called out for literary blackface as people brought up that she made this sort of separate pen name, and it looked like she made it so that she was able to write this sort of Black story. So she was able to write Black stories. So Sterling wrote a post on Facebook defending herself, but also saying that she had been told not to write POC and that she never will again. I wanted to make someone smile when they saw I wasn't afraid to write characters other people don't write about. Comment on her post said that own voices isn't a thing in romance and readers don't want it. And Sterling replied to this comment and said, I understand now why we're discouraged to write anything different than the norm. I certainly won't again. So the sort of question that this kind of boils down to is also like an evergreen question, but should white authors write BIPOC characters?
Saj's face right
now. It's difficult for me because I feel like there's two conversations here. There's a general conversation of should white authors write POC or non-white characters by POC characters. And then this particular very interesting case where I'm just like, shoot, other than the norm, which norm? First of all, that's a very like weird way to phrase it. And also this kind of like discourse, like, yeah, we're not allowed to do this and we shouldn't do this, so I'm never going to do this again. And other people, was doing something that other people aren't doing. Like, honey, other people are writing, like, you know, people of color in their books, first of all. And nobody was trying to tell her that she's not allowed to write POC characters in her books. It's more so like the weird politics of her sort of changing her name and suddenly deciding that she wants to write like Black characters. Like, I think that's what people were more focused on than the actual like thing of her being a white person writing Black characters. Yeah. I mean, that statement is so weird, and there's so much things to deconstruct there. And this assumption that, you know, she's like the white, I feel she has like a kind of white savior complex based on the way that she talked about it. Like, nobody else is writing about these poor POC. I'm going to come in and write their stories. Like, I don't know. It's giving me white savior. It's giving me,
it's giving me white savior. It's giving me give us less, honey.
I feel like part of it too is like, why are they choosing to write a person of color as maybe like their protagonist? Like, what are your reasons for this? Part of me wants to say like they shouldn't right now. Right now, no. In the future, maybe. We'll see where we get. But like right now,
no.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it depends, because I feel like a lot of people are trying to do it because the white people fear that because we're talking more about BIPOC books, about like own voices, but like these like trend words that have been coming up, well, they're becoming trend words in publishing now. They think that if they don't do this, they're not going to get published anymore. When it's like, quite frankly, you're going to get published over a BIPOC person because you are the safer bet according to publishing. And I feel like that's part of the reason why I'm very hesitant toward it now. Like, I won't outright say like, I'm not going to read this book. I'm not going to read this book because I know it's going to be problematic. But more often than not, they don't have the nuance and the range or the lived experience and able to write these stories well right now. And quite frankly, we don't have enough BIPOC authors getting the kinds of deals they would be getting to write these kinds of stories. So hot take.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I would never, because I have, and there have been some writers, but it's like very, very few where like you can feel that they have put a lot of work into it. They've done a lot of research, they put a lot of thought, which does not mean it's perfect, but you can tell the work that's gone into it. And then you can also tell the difference between that and someone who was like, cool, I need to have a character in here who's not white so I don't get called out for my all white book. Like you can, like, we know when we read the book which of these characters you were comfortable writing or which ones you put the time into and which ones you didn't. And we can also tell, usually, I think, at least that's been my experience, of like, okay, this was a character who was like sort of written more for like the sake of having a character so that you're not accused of having all white characters. And it's frustrating because like then that becomes a straw man argument in the diversity conversations. Like, I've had times where I've talked about this topic and people will be like, yeah, you know, like the only thing as bad as like an all white book are like token characters. And I want to be like, no, they're all part of the same problem. Like, they are all created by the same situation. And like, it's not an either or situation either. Like, that is something that is like about the craft and time that you're going to put into it. And there are some writers where I'm like, I'll enjoy your books and I'll enjoy it more if you don't try, because you clearly don't know what you're doing. Like, I'm just going to always read your books knowing that this is going to be the caveat on how I think about them and how I talk about them.
So I think it becomes this thing, like, not to bring it back to Sarah J. Maas again, but this is what is interesting to me when we get conversations about like Sarah J. Maas doesn't write diversity and like demanding her to do it, because you set up the situation where people are demanding that white authors like put diversity into their work, but then we get into these situations where we're asking ourselves, should white authors write non-white characters? And to me, the answer is always like, why do you want to? Like, what is your motivation for doing that? So I think that this whole thing needs to be almost like twofold. Like, you know, that person, the author, sort of interrogating why they want to write these characters. If they are the right people to write these characters, are they speaking for somebody they shouldn't be speaking for, or taking the space of somebody they shouldn't be? But also stop demanding that your white faves write diversity and go buy diverse books. Just the people who are already doing the work, go make those people super popular, and stop just demanding diversity where we don't have it, because then we get into these situations where white authors feel like, well, I have to include it. And what we're getting is just like these cardboard cutout characters or more problematic stuff. So that is where I'm like, probably you shouldn't write it, but also probably we should stop demanding it and go buy and support it where it already exists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's why I always say sorry, go ahead, Paige.
I was just gonna say I'm like at that point where I'm not looking to white writers to write books that have diversity that is like good to read or like consume in any way. I'm not here to give them props for it, even if they do it well. Like, congrats on doing the bare minimum. You're not getting any like cookies from me for like doing it. I'm at the point where I'd rather put my money and my support behind BIPOC authors doing the work, no matter what they're writing, like especially in genre and stuff. Like that's where I'm putting my energy toward these days.
Yeah, same thing with me. Like, I mean, I have like probably less than 10 authors behind me right here. 10 white authors, right? Because I just don't grab, like when I see a book that's written by a white author about a non-white experience, like I immediately get suspicious, right? Because it's like, I don't know what your motivation was. I don't know what perspective you're writing from. I don't know if you're going to really be accurately representing the people that you're writing about. And to answer the question, if a white author should write POC, you can if you want to, but there's things that you have to consider. Like, you know, you need to do your research, you need to talk to people. And this goes for any author writing outside of their experience. Like, you need to do your research, you need to talk to people, and you need, you know, the beta readers, critique partners, people to kind of help you, you know, make sure that what you're writing is not misrepresentative, and make sure that you're not doing another American Dirt or The Help or something along those lines, right? Because, and then publishing is no help because they just take anything up that any white author writes and just puts it out there, right? So, I don't know, I just feel like there's a lot of complexity in this conversation, and I don't think that white authors should not, like, I'm not here to say white authors should be banned from writing outside of their experience. All I'm saying is that there's a lot of considerations that you have to make when you're doing that. And as readers, if we want to see more diversity in our books, stop asking Victoria Schwab and Lee Bardugo and this one and that one and whoever else. Like, go support the authors who are putting that into their stories.
Yeah, and I think part of this is also understanding that, like, from reviewers, like, if we're criticizing a book for a lack of diversity, that doesn't necessarily mean that we think this writer should then, like, would be capable of handling that diversity. Like, there have been books I've read where I'm like, this book, like, I think falls flat very much because of, like, the way that it handles race. But I also don't think this writer seems capable of it, like, based on how but I think, like, when I've seen some of these conversations go awry, it's like people are saying, like, well, you're like, you know, authors can't win if they do it. You say they do this. If you say that, it's not a win-win, win-lose or whatever situation. It's about what are the books that are out there and how are we reading them and how do they reflect the way that we see the world around us being reflected in the books, what they make us think about. And sometimes what they're going to make us think about is like the lack of diversity and the stuff that's not reflected in the book. Like, that is going to be a shortcoming of the book, whether or not I think the author is someone who should take that on.
And to Sajid's point about the consideration here, we're saying should, right? But there's nothing stopping white authors from writing anything they want. You can write whatever you want, but part of the consideration here is that you should be aware that you could have criticism about this. So, like, with Isabella Sterling and her whole woe is me, like, well, I'm just gonna, ma'am, what did you expect? Like, you know, you should expect that you're opening yourself up for criticism, especially when you were, like, writing outside of your experience, that people who are within that experience might see things that you didn't see because, again, you were outside of your experience. So Bethany says it's bizarre, though, because I heard she literally just changed a few details to previously white characters thinking would sell better. Not sure if that's true, but I did, in the post that she put on Facebook, she did say herself that she wrote the book and she got, like, the pre-made artwork that had the two Black characters, and she felt weird asking the artist to change the skin color of the authors or the characters, so she just went back and change the characters to be Black characters. So
that is a whole mess. Everything about that is wrong. Everything about that situation is incorrect and should not have happened.
That literally sounds like literary blackface.
Yes.
Let me just go in the descriptions and, like, yeah, you know, it's no different. Like, that's weird to me.
Yeah, I'm going back into the comments. I lose my place, and then it's so hard.
You guys just have such good comments.
That's me in life in general.
I lose my place, and then it's so hard. TM to life. Bringing it back to Jay Kristoff said in his Insta stories, people have this asinine belief that authors can't write outside of your experience. And I was like, I mean, some can, but bro.
You have to have a certain kind of confidence.
Yeah, he's not the best person to be fighting that fight.
Okay. Anything else that you guys... All right, so moving on. Oh, this is Paige. I didn't know a ton about this, and you put in notes here.
Yes,
so we're going back to TikTok, which has been BookTok has been a whole journey for me since I joined TikTok. You know, I was the millennial who joined at the beginning of the pandemic, but BookTok is like an experience, honestly. So there was an article in the New York Times, and it was entitled "How Crying on TikTok Sells Books," and so basically the article was about how BookTok has actually been heavily impacting sales, including bestsellers, including We Were Liars and Burn After Writing, and publishers are taking note. So one specific part of the article was talking about how TikTokers are being paid by publishers to show off books. And it devolved into this conversation about reviewers, specifically bloggers, not being paid for their work. And then, you know, the TikTokers kind of came back and said, well, we work hard at what we do. So the question is kind of around paid content creation and, you know, how... I don't know. I also saw, I think it was Books with Chloe did like I think it was not necessarily tied to this. It was at a different point, but she had a thread also about how publishing thinks that like a free ARC is enough compensation for what we do when what we do takes a lot of work, especially when you're like putting together a video, recording, editing, like it's a lot of work. So how do you guys feel? Like, should we be compensated by publishers, or is there like a hierarchy of content creators? You know, is there more value to certain kinds of content versus others?
If they have money for 4 like Jay Kristoff arcs, then they have money to pay me.
Correct.
You can buy me a pizza at least.
Yeah, I feel like coming at it from me and Sajid, always me and Sajid together.
And my God.
Our one brain cell. Coming at it as somebody who like works in the like marketing side of publishing, this discussion is always interesting to me because I see like the amount of money that goes into certain books and where people choose to spend that money for their publicity and marketing campaigns. As far as being paid, there's certain things that can't be paid for, like reviews. You can't pay for reviews. We talked about this last time when I was like, I think it's illegal, and Nicole was like, yeah, I think it's illegal. Yeah, you're correct. But for things like if you're just showing it in a hall, or if you are doing like a blog tour, like there's certain things where you could be paid for it, and publishing just is choosing not to because that's the way it's always been done, where they haven't felt like they had to. With BookTok specifically, I think it's because it's generally not a review, it's just like a promotion. It's just like paying somebody to like, it's like an ad basically is what they're paying for. And yeah, like it's always interesting to like see these because we can't pay for everything, but we should be paying more people is my opinion on this side of things. But like also for a lot of people, this is a hobby. So can we pay you? Like if you have a platform, that's what people are paying for. They're paying for the numbers. They're not necessarily paying for you, the individual, because you really love books. They're not going to pay you for like, the business part of me is like, I get why they do it, but like it's still wrong on some levels.
I would love to get paid for my tears, says Jocelyn. I have so many to give.
I think like
I was thinking,
with book.
No, I was just going to say, sorry, like the lag in the internet again, like it's so annoying.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm thinking about how, being based here, people don't really like to ship out books to me. So I have a US skybox with like a freight company. So like they send it to the freight company and the freight company brings it here. But I have to pay the freight company shipping. So I don't really get like ARCs and stuff for free because I do end up having to pay a kind of shipping. So I mean, that's going into the whole like global north versus everybody else kind of conversation. But like sometimes I'm like, you know, if you really, really want me to talk about this book on my channel, like I would like to tell publishers like, hey, you know, could you send me X amount of money, not for my labor, not for like the video itself, not for promoting the book, but can you send this to like, you know, compensate for the shipping that I would have to pay for the book? Because you're paying shipping to send it to my Skybox anyways. But like, I don't know if they would be willing most of the time to pay that extra money to send it to me. So oftentimes I have to end up like paying to ship the book down here anyways, which is a privilege that not everybody in my position would have. So if you are like a reviewer in a certain part of the world where, you know, getting these resources, you know, might cost extra money, you know, that's just what I'm thinking about. Like,
I think when it comes to like how I think payment should work, it's like hard because like you guys were saying, like, you know, this is for a lot of us, it starts out as a hobby and then eventually becomes a thing that helps this whole other industry. With YouTube and with BookTube, I feel like the group that I'm mad at is less the publishers and more at YouTube, because I think YouTube really like kind of does not always treat its creators very well. And like when I think of, especially people sometimes in this conversation kind of compare us to like professional paid reviewers. They're being paid by the publication they write for, not by the publishing industry. Like it's a very important distinction. And so to me, it's like, okay, well, I say YouTube is that. With bloggers, it's harder because I don't think you have that same method of like being able to be like, well, like, hey, you know, platform that I publish on, like I drive people to your platform. It doesn't have that same kind of aspect to it. I think, I don't know if there might be blogging platforms that are better with this, but I don't really know that many of them. So I think that's like one of the things that's just hard about internet creation in general. And like, I think with like these newer platforms, like I don't think it's a coincidence too that blogging is older in some ways, or like got big in like a older way. And now like with YouTube and now with TikTok and Instagram, like those platforms that have developed in bigger ways later, like have advertising built in a way into their structure that like allows for like for creators to get compensated in a way that like, you know, correlates to what they're actually providing.
Somebody in the comments was just book chats. The last comment about my guess is that it was the one about they can't separate and tie to TikTok specifically. Certain titles we can on the back end, like we see raises and we're like, what is that from? And people have realized, specifically I'm thinking of We Were Liars, that was specifically tied to TikTok because a bunch of people were reading it. So I feel like that's part of the reason publishing is also putting money there, because they've seen like, even if we don't put money there, like look at the power they're having to the like bestseller list. And that's something that is harder to track when you're doing new release promotion on social media with like your regular like platforms like blogs and BookTube and like Bookstagram. That stuff is harder to tie back for sure. And like, because we don't often, unless we're paying somebody, we can't ask for like their analytics to see like how many clicks they got, like that kind of stuff we can't. And that's like part of the problem. Maybe if they paid a couple people and like got some data so that they could look back and see like, actually this really does impact, then they would start putting money there. But because TikTok did it by itself, that's why they're suddenly but like it's dumb because it's only for YA, but that's a whole like word thing.
Not me thinking that we should like game the system, like the whole thing with GameStop and the stocks, and that we all put our like power behind one book and then be like, BookTube did it.
Yeah.
We should.
The problem is that I feel like that about like all of the books I read. I'm like, well, like, I mean, it's BookTube.
I know.
I really vouch for the one book that I bought because of BookTube.
So Caitlin also said earlier that I think one of the fundamental problems with discussing the value of book content is that marketing under capitalism values content by the revenue it generates, not how much effort the content takes. So a lot of times people in the book community are approaching it from this place of like, you know, the effort that we put in, like we deserve because we love this thing, we're putting time in, and like Paige is saying, the thing that they're seeing right now, specifically with Book Talk, is that it's driving sales. So of course they're investing putting money into something that is driving sales. So as much as like I understand like the effort and time that goes into this hobby, like I'm not necessarily mad that publishing isn't paying me because I'm not like, you know, I might influence my friends, a handful of friends to buy books, but I'm not moving books for them. So I just, you know, I don't know.
And part of the way I see it
and
too,
I didn't really start this for the money.
Yeah, so like part of the way that I see it for me at least is like I have a job where I work on YouTube videos that I get paid for, but because of that, like I have to do those videos in line with like expectations that are out of my control. With my channel, like it is all under my control. I get to do it the way I want it. I get a lot of freedom that way. Again, that doesn't mean that I don't think like someone should maybe give me some money. I'm never gonna say no to that. But like there is like it's not just strictly like I think I should get paid for this because I put time into it. There is like a freedom to being able to do things the way I want to do them because it's just me as my boss telling myself what I'm going to make.
Yep. Not to discredit book talk, but I think it could be a valuable and creative way to talk about books. But bloggers, YouTubers, put a lot of work comparatively.
I will say TikToks are hard to do.
It is.
They are.
People
I
underestimate
do
TikTok
because they take just as much time as me fucking filming a video. I would rather film a long content video than spend that much time on one TikTok.
At the beginning of this year, I was like, I'm going to do TikTok. And I put up 2 TikToks and I have not done any more because literally it took, in order to fit my thoughts into the amount of time to record it and edit it and then caption it. Also, like it took it was like I could have made a video. So I mean, that was the type of TikTok that I made, and not to discredit other people, but there is a lot of this that is like low production and literally like just crying over videos. So that like a set or over books, which is like a separate thing. But this is going back to that, like, you know, we feel the effort that we put in and we're like, we should be paid. Where publishing is just seeing the numbers.
Like, I'm going to say just in general, my philosophy for content creation is that it's never a good idea to look at other creators and be like, I think they are doing less work than me, because I think a lot of people underestimate what the trade-offs are. It's like, okay, it might take you less time to like edit the video or something, but then the trade-off is usually you're expected to make more content. Like it's often not as straightforward as like, oh, this video is only like 30 seconds long. That takes no time. It's, I think, a lot more involved than that. Especially with algorithms. Algorithms fuck it all up for everyone.
TikTok's just terrifying in general. That is the one platform where I'm like, I don't want to be on it other than watching stuff because no.
I still have hope in my head that I will go back, but usually I'm too lazy. People are bringing up too, like as a book blogger, I've been afraid to ask for compensation because I don't want to lose the opportunity. And then Bethany says, I think part of the issue is women are not socialized to advocate for themselves and money. And a lot of the community is female, which is why I make a point of asking. So I think this is interesting too, just from the perspective of, there have been times where I did get a paid promotion. It's only been a handful of times. And then later found out like, you know, I maybe could have gotten more because of what other people were getting. But I was just like, ooh, $1. Thank you. You know, because I was so excited for the opportunity. And, you know, maybe somebody else should have gotten more money because they have a bigger platform. But also like, I don't know. I feel like you're almost so grateful to get anything that there isn't a lot of advocacy for yourself in the community right now. And publishing kind of plays with that. They know. Yeah.
I feel like part of it, like, never be afraid to ask for it, because at most they'll be like, sorry, we can't afford to pay. Like, do you still want the book? Like, they won't completely be like, you asked to be paid. No, you're not getting, like, they'll just say they can't do it for this campaign or whatever. So just ask for it. More often than not, it's better to ask because they might give it to you.
Yeah. And the other thing is, like, you know, Street Teamwork will have people retweeting, making special posts on specific dates, creating promotional art, etc. for free. And they still will tell people they can't even give them an e-art. So I think the other thing too is like knowing kind of where to draw the lines, even when I do have a promotional video and they're like, okay, we need a video, we need a separate post, we need this, I'm like, that much will cost you this much. If you just want a video, it's this much. They like a lot of times some of these agreements want to throw everything, you know, in a bag of chips under this like flat rate, where you really need to think, okay, what are they paying for versus what are they demanding? Especially when you get down to the nitty gritty of like, it needs to be on this day, it needs to be this time, you need to repost this many times. Like, are you actually paying me for that?
Yeah.
So people are saying, as a reader, I'm kind of uncomfortable with anybody talking about books critically being paid by the industry directly.
Yep.
Which is the difference between getting paid by a publication versus like the okay. I think that is all. Oh, we've got a couple more. What are we? Okay, we're at like an hour 19, and I was thinking we were gonna do like an hour and a half. So I'm gonna keep moving on. Oh, okay. Here's a fun one. Are any of these fun?
Only with you guys.
This is one that I covered on my channel in a separate video. So, I missed it. Daniel Green. Fun for us. That's true. This is about Daniel Green, who is a booktuber, and he released a self-published novella, and he received a 4-star review that sparked a conversation on Reddit, specifically because the reviewer spoke about some real world and U.S. specific parallels between police brutality in the U.S. as we experience it versus like the fictional depiction of the police in Green's work. Green this kind of devolved into a conversation on Reddit, supposedly, I didn't see it, that was about like, saying that, oh, Green must support police brutality or the police in the US because of the way that he wrote his book. So he wanted to respond, and he basically responded to say, I don't promote the things, like I don't believe in all of the things that I write about, but also addressing sort of authorial intent. I made a video about it, and the comments were very, very civil. There were a lot of people who support Green, like coming in and defending him, but in a very, very civil way. And the conversation was really interesting because obviously people fall like all over the spectrum in terms of how much stock they put into authorial intent. But there was also like in a surprising to me amount of support for authors responding to reviews, like more support for authors responding to reviews than I would have imagined. So I pose the question to you guys: should authors respond to reviewers? Like, is that something that we want? Like the thinking is that like there is a sort of conversation there that is fun or could be beneficial to authors, or that people want to encourage. And the other side of that is that we as reviewers are kind of putting out public content, and if we are putting out public content, then we are inviting sort of critique or response, and so the author has the right to respond to the public review that we put out. So what do you guys think?
Remember earlier somebody said something along the lines of, just because something is unethical doesn't mean that it's problematic. I think the reverse as well. Just because something might be possible to do or something might be legal to do doesn't mean that it's the most ethical thing. Because I think it's fine, like if an author wants to have like a general conversation with their audience or respond to things in a general way. But as a reviewer, I do feel uncomfortable if an author like wants to have a conversation like under one of my particular reviews that isn't just like a thanks for reading my book kind of thing,
Sometimes
so for me, I think there's a
yeah.
What's that?
And sometimes even that, like if I know, even if it's like a mostly positive review, but I said something negative and an author is like, thanks for reading my book, I'm like, oh, you saw that? Oh no.
Yeah, it's a very awkward thing, and it's like I don't think authors should encroach on that particular individual review space. But if you see like reviewers generally making a certain kind of critique about your book and you want to address it, or if you want to have like a fun little chat with fans on Twitter or something and maybe answer questions, like, or do an Instagram live or something, I think that that's fine. But like engaging with reviews, especially reviews that are in-depth and critical about your book, I think is it's just a little bit weird.
Yeah, I feel like I don't feel particularly dogmatic about like, no, I don't think authors should ever engage with reviewers. I used to feel more that way, but now it's more just like, I mean, you can do what you want, like it is the internet, but like it's mostly just not smart. Like I just don't think it's a great idea. Like I think for the most part, you're better off letting readers have their space and like pulling from it when it can like help you sell your books. Like I think authors retweeting like positive reviews of their books like kind of makes sense. Like that's good marketing for your book. But like diving into the reviews to like engage with them is just it doesn't go well a lot of the times.
Yeah.
There's a difference, like when I would sometimes see like authors respond to like a New York Times article, like a review of their book, that's different because like there is like the protection of the actual publication that has paid for this review. That sort of is like a buffer between like the author talking about this review in a specific piece versus like somebody directly talking to an individual who has chosen to like read your book and write a review about it. And I feel like that is just always a no. Just don't interact with readers. Let them have their space. You can interact with your trade publication pieces if that is part of how you're like entering like the publishing scene. But yeah, I'm just always like a no, especially for this situation because like it was a 4-star review and there's just like one negative comment and it's the whole death of the author thing. Like,
yeah.
Yes, it was a 4-star review, and it wasn't even necessarily like a critique as much as it was like, hey, be aware that this is in there, and like I'm. It was a little like I'm not quite sure like what it was saying or whatnot, and so the fact that Green like sort of highlighted it and responded, you know, he wanted to make a point about his authorial intent and clarify his intentions and his stance, but the fact that he did it by directly responding to a mostly positive review is what kind of left the bad taste in my mouth. And I agree that it's like we're kind of public facing, so like yes, you can do anything. The only place that I still get a little like dogmatic about it is like this idea of like critique in general and how the art should like be able to stand like exist for itself, and so this idea that authors should be able to come in and clarify for me how I experienced their book, like
totally.
I don't if I wanted to know more about your intentions, I would Google it, like I would look up things that like, but unless I'm inviting that sort of part of the experience of my consumption of art, it feels weird to like leave that door open and say, hey, if you see a review that doesn't get your work, feel free to clarify it for them, because like no, that's just not how we media.
Yeah, that's part of why I think it's such a bad idea marketing wise, because it's like you're saying like, oh, I didn't think my book was enough. Like I had to write this epilogue in this person's comments and like explain it. Like it to me just suggests that your work for the most part can't stand on its own, and like that's not going to always be the case. Like we've talked about, like, you know, the exceptions, but those exceptions again are usually rare. There's stuff like, you know, readers who like maybe are engaging with like a part of race or gender or sexual identity that's not part of their own experience, and the author clarifying, like that is pretty much my like one exception. And then like everything else I'm kind of like, you know, I think your work should be able to do that without you explaining it again.
Yeah, and I also think it sometimes kind of dismisses the readers and their intelligence, because it's not just about what the readers read and interpret about the author's work, but it's also based on what the readers know that the authors might not know. So maybe Daniel, I haven't read his book, but maybe he wrote about something that sort of mirrors police brutality, but as like a white man who has not experienced that and may not necessarily have a wide range of knowledge on that particular experience or that particular the politics around that, right? There might be people who might be more informed about that experience about you. So when they read your book, they can read between the line and pick up on things that you necessarily didn't consider when you were writing it, right? So it also sort of dismisses the readers and their intelligence, especially if you're writing something that sometimes you might be writing about an experience or a thing or a time period that a reader might know more about than you, and they might be able to pick up on things that you didn't really think about while you were writing it. And so it would kind of be weird for you to kind of come in and clarify things to somebody who knows a little bit more about what you were writing about, or not necessarily knows more about it, but they have a different view and a different perspective because they come from a different experience, if that makes sense.
Right. I have read the book now. I have like a standalone. This is what I was doing before this live show, was finishing editing like the review that's going to go up. And I think the thing that like strikes me about that experience, and I said it in this video, and I see that somebody put it in the chat a little earlier as well, is not even sort of like the commentary that is in the book, but while reading it, there were a few moments that I was just kind of cringing, like internally, about watching police shoot up a place, right? And sort of like indiscriminately kill or whatnot. Even in a fictional world, I understand that it's fantasy. So the thing that struck me was like the privilege of being able to write the story and say like, you know what I want to write about in 2021 as an American. Fictional cops who abuse their power. Like, amazing. Those are my protagonists. So like, you can, and I'm not begrudging him his story. I'm not saying he couldn't have written it, and I'm not saying that anything in it like told me that Daniel Green is pro police brutality. That's ridiculous. I just feel like that there is a certain privilege that you have to acknowledge, that this like topic affects you so little that you felt comfortable writing the story, where me reading it, like I was cringing and I couldn't stop thinking about like the very public trial that's going on right now about somebody who killed a Black man in the United States. And so like those feelings were warring in my head while I was reading this. So I was like, aha, I found the privilege. Here it is. Like,
like that was exactly the problem I had with Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes when we read it last year. It was like there is innate privilege to like deciding that this is a point of view that you want to explore, and I tend not to gravitate toward those books because like I've already thought about all these things that you were apparently exploring for the first time from this point of view, from my perspective. And like also a like phrase that's been going around in like my life personally that we've been talking about is like intent versus impacts. Like just because you intend something doesn't mean it's going to impact the reader in that way, and you can't tell somebody that their impact is wrong because your intent was different from what they expected it to be.
Correct. I just saw this for anyone that's nosy. If a thread is deleted on, I think Reddit, replace the Reddit in the URL with RevVegget, and you'll see the deleted post, which is like a hot tip. I did not know that.
Screenshot.
I know, and I'm like, I've been dying to know what the comments actually were. So I know that the comments or the chat is a little moved on from this. But if anybody saw those comments, wants to fill us in. So somebody says, I think there's a misunderstanding in this about reviewer versus fandom spaces being conflated. I agree with that. A lot of people were coming into my comments and saying like, well, I want author engagement. And my answer to everybody was like, I run an event. Like and we invite authors. Like I love authors on panels. I love author interviews. I follow some authors on Twitter. Like I'm not advocating for no author engagement, but I think that there's a difference between that and like where you've arranged and invited that versus author coming into specifically reviewer spaces.
Yeah, like I was saying before, there's a difference between that, like a review space, and like an Instagram live where you answer questions about the book.
Yeah, one author recently, as an anecdote, asked what they could do to improve their Goodreads like situation, and I had to be like, don't reply to anybody about their reviews. Please just do not interact with reviews. That is wrong. Do not do it. Like, so like people are taking note of it on the behind the scenes, trying to tell authors to back off. So hopefully like that sort of starts being seen.
I already have fans telling me I'm reading a book wrong. I don't need the author to do that too.
That is the take.
I think Daniel Green obviously thinks that this discourse is something we should be moving towards, but I would say that if you review his book, expect to have it answered. Oh God.
Maddie, there's gonna be a whole video about your video. That's how it's gonna
go. Everybody come support me in my time of need if that happens.
You can just title it Dear Daniel Green.
Let's see. What else have we got in the comments? Okay, while I'm scrolling through, I wanted to also ask you guys, how do you personally feel about authorial intent? There's no right answer here, but I'm curious. Like, are you somebody who does like look at interviews? Do you Google stuff? Like, are you interested in what the author intended at all? Like during or after you've read a book?
I feel like I only search it if I feel like there is like cultural nuance that I don't have if I'm reading outside of my own like experience and perspective. I want to read what the author's intent was or learn more about like their experience so that I'm like fully critically viewing the book with more nuance than I would have just by reading from my own personal like perspective. But generally, if it's just like a random book, I don't really care what the author's intent was. I'm here for my own experience reading the book.
I'm kind of a mixture of both. No, sorry. I'm sorry. That's all I had to say. I'm kind of a mixture of both. I like understanding where the author is coming from, and I do think that is very important in certain cases, as you were saying, Paige. Like if the author is coming from like a more personal perspective. But I also love just kind of like adding my own interpretations onto things. Like I recently rewatched my review of Tahana Mafi's book, A Very Large Expanse of Sea, and I was reading deep into that shit to the point where I know Miss Mafi wasn't thinking about half the things I was talking about, but like I do feel like my interpretations of the book were also kind of valid, right? So I think like there's room for like playing around with both perspectives.
Yeah, I think a thing I realized about myself is I used to say like, no, I don't really care about authorial intent. And then I realized like all of the ways that I was reading books was to get at what I thought the author's intent was. And I was like, well, no, I'm pretty nosy. Like I want to know. It's just more like, do I care? And like, it's like, or like, how do I care? Like, what is it about their intent? How is it about how they frame their intent and explain it, and how that like matches up or doesn't match up with like what I've read or what I've watched? That's like where it all kind of comes together.
Yeah, I think that it has a lot to do with the way that I personally, and I don't know if this is kind of like a universal, like school age sort of thing, but was taught to pick apart media, like at least in high school, middle school was very much like, what do you think the author meant? So we're almost framed to think that way in terms of what the author's intent is. And and like now in my adulthood and after completing like a communications degree, like I understand a little bit more about like the different ways we can approach like a thing, but I am also very nosy. So I tend to like really like, not always, but I am somebody who will like look up interviews and I am curious about what the author's motivation or inspiration or intent was. But then there is always that moment of like deciding, okay, how much do I care, or how much does this matter? Like knowing their intent, did it add anything to me, or is this a place where the intent does not negate the impact? Where like I see what you're like, thank you for telling me what you were going for, but you didn't do it. Like
yeah.
So do you guys think that author engagement with review upsales reader engagement? I hear that advocated by him, but I am unconvinced. I think that this was probably like not a smart move, but I think that Green got more coverage for his book by doing this.
Sure. I didn't know about it.
Right. And I talked about it in my channel. Now I've got like a review of it going up. I bought the damn book, so joke's on me.
I was like, I had this whole thing about how I think it's not great marketing, and I was like, well, sometimes maybe it is. But you probably have to be in like the right situation.
Right.
Yeah. And people are like, there's no such thing as bad publicity or whatever. I'd argue there is such a thing as bad publicity. Just because it's worked for you in your favor this time, you're building a record for yourself that people are going to look back on for your future work. So if you're going to start this way and you're trying to game the system, people aren't going to trust you later on. So it's a game to play, but like, what are the consequences for your future career?
Yeah. So somebody says, I think he should have stayed out of it, but he's in a weird spot. He has a huge sci-fi news following. Where is his line between booktuber and author? Which I think a lot of people brought up in my comments too, is like, well, he's a booktuber, right? So he's part of this space in some regard. And also he's self-publishing. So there's kind of like that engagement and interaction that feels a little closer versus like maybe a traditionally published person. So, we talked a little bit about this, I think, when we were talking about Sasha Alsberg, and how as people within the community continue to publish, like we're going to have to start navigating this space between like this person was a peer, now they're an author, I'm a reviewer, but also that person has to now switch the roles between I was a reviewer or an author tuber, now I'm an author. So does that change things, or should it change things?
I feel like it's different for indie authors specifically, because if you're a more traditionally published author, I tend to see those people step back because you're going to have to get blurbs for that book. And if you're out here reviewing books and saying what you think about them, and if you don't like them, and then your editor doesn't know you posted that video and goes to ask this author for a blurb, like, things get messy. So I see people stepping back more. So I wonder if it's going to be different if he plans to just continue to indie pub. Like, then he can stay in the reviewer space. It won't really impact him in that way. But if he is gearing toward traditional publishing, it sort of is going to blur the line, because you're going to become a peer for the authors now.
Yeah, that's something I've just been curious about in general, is like what reviewer spaces are going to look like as people become writers, like, because that is like a thing people do on BookTube, and like presumably people will get published. And I've been very curious about what that will look like in terms of how, like, whether people will still feel comfortable being very upfront about their feelings, especially when you see people do that and then also like talk about the book they're writing. Like, there's always like the, like, how is this book that you're writing going to end up stacking up against the feelings that you're talking about now, and just also like the general like interaction with other authors whose books you've talked about. This is separate from the Daniel Green like stuff, but it's just a thing I keep wondering about.
Any other thoughts on Daniel Green, authorial intent, review spaces? Okay, we're winding down, and I'm like getting tired. There was one other thing. I mean, there were two things on this list, but there's one thing that I'm like dying to hear about, and that is from it's about the State of Racial Diversity in Romance report that's put out by the Rip Bodice every year. It started in 2016. They're an independent romance bookstore, and they've been publishing this report about how many romance books are published each year written by BIPOC. So this year there was some critique of their report, which gained traction, particularly as it pertains to the lack of clarity around the methods of their data collection, and sort of like the presentation of the data wasn't clear either. So main concerns also included the lack of consent from the participants, the presentation of the data being misleading or incomplete, or the authors of the report sometimes using photographs to identify authors if they haven't self-identified in reviews or in bios, or in interviews or in bios. So I did a live show on Mara's channel about this, and I had like my like stance of it. And then I sent Deboki an email. I'm like, Deboki, I'm dying to hear your take on this as a scientist, as a person who actually knows about like data. And then she like responded something back to me, and I was like, oh no, is my take wrong?
No, so, your take is probably not wrong. It's so I see this conversation basically, and I've read the critique by Nick and Ari on the Ripped Bodice, and I looked at the Ripped Bodice's report. Both, I think they've updated it since then, because the version that's on their website now is different. And I had like looked through their responses, and I had a lot of frustrations with the way that the critique was framed. And I just want to be clear, like, I'm coming at this from a background, like from science, but my background is in engineering, so it's not in social science. But like, I am basing this also then on conversations with social scientists who are predominantly economists, because that is who I know in my life. And the norms in different fields may sometimes be different. So I want to like issue that caveat. Also, a lot of the reasons why I have strong feelings about this is because the way that they talk about it is related to how we talk about data in general. And like, I was a scientist and now I'm a science writer. So some of the ways that they talk about data, I think, is a little bit like not out of line. It's not really what I think of as like the most useful way to think about data. And so there are a few aspects of their critique that I like don't really agree with, at least as they've framed it. Starting with the ethics, in terms of like the ethics of using publicly available information, there's this issue of consent, but because it's publicly available information, like it's like the idea of consent applying in the way that they've described it. I think they like even like say specifically, like in a professional setting, a study like this would have been cast aside immediately. Like that is not true. Like people use this kind of publicly available information all the time to make categorizations about gender, at least. The Vita Count study that they kind of cite as this really good alternative does that. And I think we can talk about whether or not the Vita Count does it better. Like they outline some of their methods, they have this rubric, but I agree with kind of this like fundamental thing that like, yeah, I think the RIP bodice should be more transparent about their methods. And I agree with this kind of like numbers complaint of like, yeah, I'd like to see the sample sizes for these different publishers for like how many different books are we looking at it in terms of like how that affects our reading. But I think what's been like frustrating for me is like basically like a lot of the arguments become whether or not the quality of the data is good or bad. And data is like not really good or bad. Data, like the strength of data is really more in how we analyze it. It's how we interpret it. There is no perfect data set. Every data set incorporates bias and noise and how it's gathered. And there's also going to be bias and noise in like how we interpret it. And so it's really on us as like the interpreters of that data to make sure we're doing a strong interpretation. And so I think like, yes, I think there are ways that the ripped bodice could be reporting their data that allows for a stronger interpretation. But the details like about the data that they present to me don't really build to like a coherent argument about what's wrong with the data or its presentation. And I don't think they're really a sufficient analysis of the conclusions that are made by the ripped bodice. And I'm sorry, I feel so like pedantic talking about this in this way, and I would usually be less pedantic about it in this way, except I think their argument is based on like we should be rigorously studying these data points, which I fully agree with. I think like anytime you have data, you want to be as rigorous as possible, but I don't think that their arguments are necessarily applied with the same rigor. But with that said, while I have frustrations with their critique, I also think that what the critique they're like saying, especially like with regards to the ethics in particular about labeling people's race, I think they're actually like that is built on something real. And so like if you also feel frustrated with this data, I don't want to say this to discount that, because I think that's real, and I think it informs what kind of ways we should be best gathering this data and analyzing it. Because I think, you know, using this publicly available information, like yes, that might be a currently accepted research practice, but ethics are always an evolving thing. And so like I think it's useful to have that information, and especially with regards to race, like part of the reason why it's so messy is because our definitions of race are like based on classifications that are built on like white supremacy and imperialism. Like the way that we define these things are built on problematic histories, and like the definitions are tough to deal with on their own. And so the way that we classify this data is going to be evolving as well. So sorry, that is my like attempt to summarize my feelings.
No, I think it's really important because, like, you know, I approach this from, you know, the perspective of somebody who works in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think that I was using language to say, you know, talk about like sort of bad data when I was really trying to get at what you're talking about, like the strength of the analysis and the presentation of the data, and not necessarily just like this idea of like bad data, which is like a term that we saw kind of like spread around. So yeah. I find this fascinating. Like I know you're I'm sorry, but no, like I think it's like a really valid part of the conversation. I think that, you know, the lack of transparency to some of this makes it like opens it up to even more critique almost, because they did say that they collect a lot of this information from publicly available things like biographies. You know, a lot of authors have biographies on their website where they identify in a number of ways, or like interviews or things of that nature, but then they included also and like photographs. So without knowing like what exactly that means, are we talking about like one photograph? Are you talking about like everybody did you just look up a bunch of pictures? Like we don't know. And sort of that uncertainty like added so much ickiness to me, like and caused me to question so much of their data collection and sort of their data presentation. So then like the report itself, like you start questioning sort of like the value of what they're present. Like can we trust it is kind of what like where I was getting at.
I think sorry,
I feel like you talked enough.
No, go for it.
I feel like you have more to say on it than me because like data is not obviously my strong set. I am literally social media all the time, every time. But
still important. I think like, more people go for it. I'm gonna stop talking.
What was interesting to me is because in Canada specifically, we are working on, well, a subset of people have gathered from a bunch of different companies and they're looking into Onyx and like metadata and how we can improve that for like own voice specific like content and like the ethics of it. Like, should we even be asking authors for this kind of information because it puts them in danger sometimes if this is like readily available information, if it's available for anybody who wants to like harm them. And so like seeing this conversation happening, it was something we brought back to like the overall panel discussing this sort of stuff because it is important to have this kind of information. And that's why like publishers and other people within the industry are trying to like fix what kind of information is available so we can see where the disparities are, like firmly, like we can have numbers point to like we need to fix these specific areas. But a part of me also coming into this is like, well, it's good that any kind of attention is being placed on this stuff because we need to be having these conversations overall. And like this shouldn't be the be all end all of the conversations we're having. And it sort of has become like the Lee and Low, where Lee and Low talks about publishing, but it's only specifically about like US publishing and where are they getting their information from? Like, are they having people actually submit like that kind of stuff as well? But like, because it is triggering conversations, I feel like it's still important to have. So like the data stuff, I just understand none of it, but I'm like, but at least people are having these conversations and it's like making publishing notice that people are talking about disparities and they're taking notice of like what publishers are interacting with these kind of studies because we're not giving the information ourselves.
So we're publishers laughing at our discourse like Alyssa Cole suggested.
I don't even think, at least here, nobody knew it was happening. Like, I'm pretty sure I'm the only person on my team that like saw like these conversations were happening. They're very oblivious unless they're part of like the book community online. They're not going to see these conversations taking place. And that's a whole problem by itself of like, we are very invested and we have all these talks, but often it's down to employees who are actually part of the communities to bring back these discussions to publishers. Because once they're making money, they don't care about anything else.
Yeah, I think one of the things like with data in general is like it's going to just continue being so important, not just in this context. It's why I'm like very heated about this. Like in one point, like one of the things that they mention is like a potential harm of this study is like media misrepresenting it. And as someone who is a science writer, a thing I do every week is to look at studies and figure out how to write about them. And that includes looking at how they do their experiments, looking at how they're reporting their numbers and stuff like that. So like some of this argument in terms of the downstream harm that they are saying this study can cause, to me, are frustrating in part because they like imply a lack of agency to me on the part of the reader, on the part of whoever is covering it in turn. Like they also have this hypothetical example of like an author who is looking to figure out where is a good place for them to publish. And we'll see like, okay, this one imprint has these great numbers, but they're going to miss out on this other stuff that's going on. And I think the other important point to me is like, because data is becoming so important and because we like there's like a general idea in our like society that science and data is inherently like this valuable thing that's going to tell us really great things, that like just seeing numbers is going to solve things. And I think especially in the context of diversity conversations, it doesn't. Like people see these numbers and like we know that they're like, oh, this is bad, and they use those numbers to say this is bad, and like just like qualitatively I'm like, well, is it getting better? And like I think what I want to say there is like numbers are going to be really like an important part of the conversation, but also numbers are not going to explain, like there's no data set that is going to cover the entirety of like the diversity problem, and there is no way that we are going to analyze quantitatively our way out of racism. Like it's also going to take qualitative assessments of what's going on and like actually engaging with people's personal anecdotal experiences as well to understand like all of these other aspects to people's experience that you can't get from numbers. And so when I saw those kinds of examples being given as like downstream harm, that's part of what was frustrating to me, because I think it takes on a very limited view of like what the use of data is, because that data set is not published as a guide for authors to figure out where they're going to publish. Like that is on us to understand how we are going to understand data. And unfortunately, it's not a thing that's not necessarily well taught. So maybe that's part of the issue as well. Like they kind of have in the beginning, like this idea like that of the Nick and Ari critique, like one of the things they cite is like the need for dealing with like data literacy and misinformation. And so that's like kind of what's motivating them. And I agree with that inspiration and like wanting to really move towards that. But that argument to me is like really at odds with that. Like this is not our way of improving data literacy, of like kind of just being like, okay, well, if we get as perfect of a data set as possible, that's going to prevent misinformation. That's not what's going to prevent it. It's going to be us learning how to engage with data.
Yeah. And I think that is kind of part of the conversation, that like the next part of it is kind of like talking about the ripped bodice in general, like putting this forward. And my question was like, to what end are, what is kind of like their purpose? And is it just to present the data and walk away? But if that is the case, then why them? Because they're an independent bookstore. Like, so why, and at what point, like, I guess part of the answer to that is that nobody else was doing it. And so they stepped up and they said, okay, we're going to analyze this information. But now, after this many years in, I think it's valid to sort of question, like, are there ways that we can, that this could evolve? Are there better ways to capture this and present this information? And then, like, what now? Well, like, what's the analysis here? What are the calls to action sort of moving on from this?
Yeah, and I have to say that part of the reason why I personally just like had like a seeing red kind of moment with this specific critique is they have this one sentence. Obviously, neither of these projects is a task for a single person, nor is it one that can be completed within a short timeline, especially without the proper training, expertise, and rubric, which is why not everyone is, nor should they be conducting research studies. And that to me felt like what they were actually trying to argue was saying basically that they should not be doing the study. And that for me is a really hard point, because like for me to agree with inherently, and especially because I don't think that the argument laid out necessarily to me personally suggests that there's something in this data that makes it that like the ripped bodice shouldn't be doing it at all. Like, yes, there are ways to improve it and maybe someone can do it better, but the framing of that argument for me is really difficult, along like with thinking again about like how we should be doing like data literacy and against this reality of how data visualization is becoming such a common thing across multiple media forms. It's part of why, like, yes, I want to clarify, this does not mean I think that the ripped bodices like report is above critique. When I look at these kinds of reports, I tend to kind of like basically look at them. They don't offer a lot of analysis. There's not a lot of stats work being done. And I think they're useful for like seeing kind of like a trend and stuff like that. But if I were going to write about them, like I would probably like kind of say like, hey, this is like the maybe like a specific year, like this is what they reported for 1 year, one set of publishers or something like that. But I would probably not draw too many global conclusions that I would say outright, this is what the data says. Or I might put in like a lot of qualifiers, like the data suggests this, but like we need more analysis, which to me is still useful. I still like it. Do I think it's like, again, gonna like be perfect? No. And I don't think we should like end with this being the state of our diversity reports. But I just like, I'm uncomfortable with this sort of gatekeepy kind of approach to saying, well, like you have to have these qualifications to do this kind of study at all, because I think they've taken on a very small, narrow project because they know what their limitations are. And I think it's right for people to be frustrated that it's limited, but like, yeah, that's where I feel.
So part of this is like the ripped bodice diversity report shouldn't be quoted as the end all be all, and it is. So I think that part of what the like disconnect between what you're saying in terms of like, okay, they took on a very narrow project, the scope was very narrow because of their limitations, and that's okay. But the way that it's presented almost, and maybe that they have some responsibility in this, because there's almost like a publicity tour that they do when this report is coming out, right?
Yeah.
They're taking interviews, they're like talking about it, they're presenting it in such a way that I think gives it a little bit more sort of, I don't know, importance. I don't know if that's the right word, but that kind of presents it in a way that like it's not necessarily that thing, right? Because of the narrow scope of it, like this, I don't know. It gave me icky vibes. Honestly, the way that they kind of talk about it and present it, and then their sort of like reaction to the critique too. I was kind of like, there was a way to do this in a more graceful way to sort of react to the critique that you got.
Yeah, I just again want to make it clear, like I'm not defending like their report like as is. Like I said, I think there's things that I get out of it, and like in terms of like how they use it as a marketing thing, I think like that's a valid like conversation in terms of like how we like again like if we're going to talk about like how we use stats as like this kind of marketing tool, like how that's kind of how people frame themselves as like knowing things. Like I think that's all like pretty valid. It's just for me in terms of the critiques laid out in this article, like it didn't really hold a lot of water for me in terms of like invalidating the results as they are or as they're presented.
So people are really enjoyed. Like I know you were like sorry, but people were like that was awesome. So they were here. They were here for your.
Yeah, don't worry. I have a multi-page outline like that I keep debating whether I was really happy that you put this here, because I figured when I was thinking about like my frustrations, it's very much just in terms of how it talks about data, but I also think that the way it talks, like I think the bigger conversation about what it means for how we talk about diversity is incredibly important. And so I have all of my thoughts about the data side, and like I just don't want to like have that be the extent of my thoughts on it, because like that I don't want to divorce that from like the importance of making sure we're talking about diversity in a responsible way.
Right. More praise for Devoki is so on point.
Thank you.
Let's see. People are saying you should make your video.
Thank you guys for helping me clarify too. Like seriously, talking it out with people who are like very interested in this and also like very invested in the diversity aspect. So I'm curious, because Marty, you're saying like when you replied, you're like, seeing this from the DEI side. Like, do you see this, like, do you see a way that people use this data, I guess, like in conversation? Like,
so yes, I think that data is really important in DEI work because, we talked about this too, like as, people of color, you sort of we know that publishing is white, right? Yeah. Like we have, we know this, and we also have like a bunch of anecdotal, like stuff that supports sort of our experiences and what we know to be true. But a lot of times when you're working in DEI, and not that this should be sort of the thing, but you almost need the data in order to get people's buy-in, right? Because my saying that this is my anecdotal like experience, or my saying like, this company is really white, or this whatever it is, like that oftentimes isn't enough. And so it has become, unfortunately, this thing where you almost need the data to back it up, right? And you see this a lot if you just go look at open positions for DEI positions in companies. You'll see that they are really heavy in data analytics, because they want you to be able to not only sort of prove it to the shareholders and say like, here are the problems, but they also want you to be able to track gains, right? So they want you to be able to say, here's where we started, here's the change that we enacted, and here's where we ended up. So it is super important to have reliable data, just because you're starting a lot of times with a bunch of shareholders who are only marginally invested in getting this sort of thing off the ground. And a lot of times that investment is very much from a place of like, we know we need to do this, or we've been shamed into doing this. So like, here we are.
Yeah.
So if you have any sort of report or data that can be questioned in such a significant way, I almost feel you're like shooting yourself in the foot, right? You're starting at a place where it becomes even harder to have these conversations when people are having more conversations about questioning the transparency and the presentation of the data, instead of the actual problem here, which is that it was abysmal, the number of romance books published by BIPOC in the year 2020. And that was like sort of the talking point, and the way that we got away from that, because now there's all these questions of like, like, how did you identify? How did you present? How many books are we talking about? Like, now that becomes such a problem. So from a DEI perspective, like it bothers me because I know how important it is to have sort of like that analysis and sort of that backing, because I need it in order to do my work. And, you know, the other part of it is that, like, you know, maybe this isn't where the ripped bodice comes in, but it just kind of goes back to that question of like, okay, so what is like their intent of putting this out? But we have these like numbers year over year, and I don't even like, what is the point of continuing to show us this without any plan of, like, is there a plan of action? Like, what are we getting at here? And that isn't just like a reminder that like publishing doesn't publish BIPOC people, you know, like, okay, like it gets almost a little like depressing. And especially when you have two white people who are putting out this report who are, for all intents and purposes, like profiting off of it. So like, what are we doing? What are we doing here? Why are we doing it? You know?
Yeah.
I agree with the Boki that like the focus on the numbers does hinder any sort of progress, though, because speaking from like the DEI side of things, like I'm at a company where we're trying to figure out what the numbers are specifically with staff, and like there's a lack of nuance looking at the numbers as they are, of like, where primarily are the BIPOC staff within the company? Are they actually in positions that touch books, or are they like warehouse staff and like like staff that the office services, that kind of stuff? And like, because we don't have these conversations, and if it's just a focus on numbers of like, we have this percentage, we need to get to this percentage, there's no nuanced conversation about how do we make this sustainable for the people that we're actually bringing into the company, / like the books that we're publishing. If we increase the number of books we're publishing, are we changing how we market these books? Are we changing where we put these books, the audiences that we're trying to reach? Like, there needs to be more conversation about like the actual impact of these numbers on the people who are working, as well as the people we're trying to like reach and like improve our numbers with. Yeah,
I think one of the things that's hard to me too is like the idea, like proving, I don't know if this is the context that you're talking about shareholders in, but I think one of the things that's hard for me with data and DEI work is like the feeling that like we have to prove with numbers that
100%,
we're worth it. And it's like, like, did you have to do this before, or is it only because we like now want it in, or like what is like what is the point of the what is the point of the numbers? And so this goes back for me to like the idea of like, what is our analysis, like what is it we're hoping to get out of the data? Like in this case, this data set's probably not going to apply to a lot of the questions that a lot of us are interested in. Like for a lot of us who have like moved past the initial point of like, I think romance publishing does not publish a lot of BIPOC authors, this data set's probably not going to provide that information. And so I think like in that context, like, yes, it's frustrating that this is like then the one that gets a lot of that kind of thing. I will say I'm personally like, I know a lot of like that mentality, like in the critique too, they say like, you know, the whiteness is self-evident. For me personally, coming just from like my nitpicky science side of like, my feeling is sort of like, yes, it's self-evident, but to like, who is the we here? It's like, it's
that I missed everything, everybody, but my technology.
I think this was sent from really like 10 minutes in the past.
Time machine. Yeah. But yeah, like, so I personally like the numbers just for my own curiosity of just kind of seeing, okay, like comparing these different imprints too, in particular is for me just like interesting in that way. In terms of like actual analysis, like I agree, like to the extent that it's limited, like, I agree. But it's just like, it's a quantity that I'm like, I want to know. And in the long run, it's the kind of thing where you can start to like, if you want to, like, you can ask questions about it and see trends. Especially for me, that is the value of it happening year to year, is seeing, is there a trend or is there not? Our analysis of the trend is going to be pretty limited because they're not doing like a lot of stats or anything. But for me, it is like a thing that because and that's also probably because I'm not dealing with it in the context of DEI work. It's not coming up in the context of anything I have to do like professionally, and I think it'd be a lot more aggravating if I had to do this to convince people of like, hey, just fucking be diverse.
Yes,
or really just stop.
Those are like the dueling points though, is that like on the one hand, you feel like, it should be, it is kind of self-evident, but, there is still value in saying, in like putting that, with numbers and saying like, I mean, it's self-evident to probably certain people, but not everyone. So that's kind of where I think it starts in DEI work of like, okay, let's make it evident for everybody by putting numbers. But what it sort of evolves into, or it can evolve into, is this place of, what I was talking about, where it's like, well, prove it. Which is very different than like, well, let's get the data to back it up, or let's see let's like hone in on exactly what the problem is, and let's get detailed versus like just saying kind of a broad thing. But you do get to a place where it is very much like prove it, and then you're like, you're fighting for your importance at that point, and that really sucks. So
yeah. Data's not going to fix diversity. Like people not being assholes is like white. Like I mean, and even that feels too simplistic. It's just like
yes, and public, to be honest, this is a huge like publishing problem, and so just structurally there's so much that needs to happen for us to see these numbers change, which is another thing. Like, is it the who, like the report, I don't know, the influence of the report or who it's supposed to be for is also something that's kind of like in question in my mind. Like, I think that the data is like really interesting and I want to see it, but also like, what am I supposed to do about this? Like, I don't know. So until publishing, like those shareholders kind of get on the train of saying like, this is something that we want to change, this is like change that we want to enact, and that we have clear view of how that needs to be done. And that is very much like Paige was saying, getting BIPOC into decision-making roles, like things like that, then we can publish all the reports we want, but what kind of change are we really going to see?
And like seeing like the focus, I feel like on book Twitter specifically, obviously because the audience is always on like books and authors, but coming from as a professional in the industry, that often frustrates me because I know problems are still going to continue no matter, like that's a band-aid that fixes the optical part of publishing, but internally, like those authors aren't going to have the teams that they need in order to support them, in order to make their books the best that they can be, without like fixing it with a white gaze and like all this kind of stuff that happens behind the scenes. And like the publicity team isn't gonna be able to reach the audiences that this book could reach because they don't know what those audiences are. So like it's a frustrating, like all the behind the scenes stuff that is happening that we're trying to talk about often gets pushed to the side because it's like, obviously the authors are the more well-known elements of the industry, and that tends to be like the primary focus.
So people are agreeing they need change at so many levels: who works in publishing, who's acquiring, who's making publicity decisions, what is being acquired or pushed, who's giving J. Kristoff 4 arcs.
There's this SNS author editor that I can't remember the name of them right now off the top of my head, but they were discussing in an Instagram live, because they're acquiring BIPOC authors specifically, about how also when people are put in these decision-making roles, they're often expected so much more of them versus like their counterparts, and like there's only so much that people within the industry who are there right now can do to make the change. So like pushing for more change and more people means that we can like improve all of these elements as well in the future.
Anything, Sajid? Are you here?
I think I'm in real time now, right? Am I? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, now I know how time travel works.
I know.
I love that. You literally discovered time travel. That's so impressive. We fixed time travel on this live, guys.
Yeah,
I know.
We didn't even know it was broken.
Anything else? Any thoughts you want to sprinkle in at the end here?
We saved our like nerdiest discussion for the end. Our brains are all the most tired.
I like missed most of it. So I was just kind of like half confused for like a second, and it didn't help that I was like 5 minutes in the past.
All right. Well, I said in my head
again because I will get a new laptop eventually, and so the next live show, this will not be an occurrence that happens consistently.
We're rooting for you.
It adds spice to the conversation.
Next live stream is fixing his Wi-Fi.
So yes, I was
This is
saying
bad representation for the global South people.
We'll do this again. Q2, I think a quarterly recap. I mean, there's a ton to cover, but I think it's fun to do it sort of like in this retrospective. So we'll be back. I mean, I'm assuming you guys will say yes again. At the end of these live shows, I always like publicly bully you guys into a new one. So
if anybody has any ideas for the name of this group, please let us know. We need one.
And then in the next 3 months, if you guys see anything that you would like us to take on or cover, just, at me in the spicy Twitter threads or whatever, or send me a message, and so we can keep track of like kind of what's going on. So thank you so much for joining us. The chat was on point tonight. And so happy you guys could join us, and we'll see you next time. We'll see you at the end of quarter 2. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.